Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a really fascinating concept, prefigurative politics, or living the future in the present. If you're currently organizing a community, living in a collective, or just generally trying to build a boss-free world from the ground up, the source text we're looking at today is going to speak directly to how we structure our everyday lives. So let's just jump right in and break down the core arguments. Right off the bat, the text hits us with this massive foundational question. Can unjust means ever actually produce just ends? Now, for centuries, traditional power politics has basically told us, yeah, sure they can. But let's frame this within a scenario you might be pretty familiar with. Imagine you and your collective are trying to build a completely equal horizontal community. Can you actually achieve that by, say, temporarily appointing a boss to lead you there? The source text argues that history answers this with a huge, resounding no. When emancipation movements start adopting authoritarian or manipulative methods, they don't get rid of domination. They literally just reproduce it in shiny new packaging. And that brings us to how the text defines prefigurative politics. Simply put, it is the radical refusal to separate ends from means. It's the practice of building structures right now, today, that perfectly reflect the egalitarian future you want to see. Prefiguration insists that the future society isn't just something you sit around waiting for. It's something you have to actively live and practice in your current struggle. The whole idea is you don't fight for equality using hierarchy. You fight for equality by actually practicing equality. To really drive this home, the text draws a super stark contrast between two distinct worldviews. On one side, you have traditional power politics. This covers everything from monarchies to liberal democracies to Marxist-Leninist states. Their whole governing rule is that the end justifies the means, meaning coercion, secrecy, and manipulation are totally fine if they get you to order or liberation. But on the flip side, prefigurative politics argues that ends and means are a package deal. They are entirely inseparable. The text asserts quite bluntly that you simply cannot birth freedom through authoritarian control. It just doesn't work that way. Now, the text uses a really specific phrase to explain why separating the two always fails. It says that means are not neutral tools. They are social relations in motion. Let's bring this back to the commune for a second. Imagine your collective is really struggling to get the dishes done. It's a mess. So, out of frustration, you decide to appoint a chore czar who has the power to punish people for leaving plates in the sink. Well, you might get clean dishes in the short term, but what are you actually building? The text argues that if you organize through command and obedience, you're rehearsing the exact structure of the society you're going to create. You're rehearsing domination. The source actually pulls in this brilliant historical critique from Rudolf Rocker to back this up. He wrote that the maxim that the end justifies the means has always been the first article of faith of all power politics. And what's interesting is how the text applies this sweeping indictment. It's not just aimed at emperors and dictators, it's aimed equally at revolutionary parties. The argument here is that any movement that thinks domination is just a temporary, convenient little tool on the path to freedom is falling into a massive trap. The baseness of the method is directly tied to the decay of the movement itself. So how does this play out in practice? Well, the source uses this logic to critique traditional leftist vanguard parties. It points out a glaring contradiction. Despite using all this soaring revolutionary rhetoric, these parties usually maintain intensely hierarchical systems. Authority flows strictly downward. They consolidate political influence and intellectual authority right at the top, and they expect the everyday members to just implement decisions, not shape them. According to the text, this isn't some accidental flaw. It's a structural feature that mirrors the exact top-down logic of right-wing systems. And why does that happen? Why do those structures persist? The text gives a really simple, powerful answer. Authority habituates itself, power consolidates. Once established, the grammar of domination becomes institutional memory. Think about a permanent garden committee in a housing co-op. If you give a small, centralized group total, unchecked authority over the planting strategy and the budget, well, they rarely just magically dissolve their own power and hand it back to the whole group once the harvest is in, right? The text argues that a centralized vanguard behaves the exact same way, just on a macro level. To combat this whole dynamic, the text maps out a totally different structural approach. Instead of falling back on centralization and heavy bureaucracy, prefiguration builds horizontal networks. Instead of these powerful executive committees making decisions behind closed doors, it demands open, neighborhood assemblies. And instead of permanent leadership, like our Eternal Garden Committee, it insists on rotating responsibilities and direct everyday participation. The core message is clear. You have to build egalitarian structures today if you want egalitarian outcomes tomorrow. This brings us to a really famous phrase from the anarchist tradition that the text highlights: building the new world in the shell of the old. I love this framing because it views liberation not as some magical gift postponed until after power is seized or something handed down from leaders on high. Instead, change is cultivated from the grassroots. It's about living your relationships in a way that erodes the legitimacy of domination right now, while simultaneously strengthening your community's actual capacity to organize itself. Okay, so how do we practically do this? The text outlines this through the construction of what's called dual power, and the steps are surprisingly straightforward. First, you actively reject paramedial party structures. You just say no to them. Second, you establish horizontal local assemblies where voices carry equal weight. And third, you practice direct daily participation. You don't petition the state, you don't wait for a revolution to miraculously descend from above. You literally just start organizing the structures of freedom right where you are. The text specifically points to autonomous spaces as the living laboratories where all of this happens. We're talking about communes, cooperatives, councils, neighborhood assemblies, mutual aid networks. If you are listening to this from a collective house or an anarchist commune, the text is actually validating that your lived experiences, your cooperative models, your consensus meetings, your mutual aid pantries, these are the exact embodiments of a free society growing within the shell of the old. You are literally practicing the theory. And recognizing this leads to a massive paradigm shift outlined in the source. Think about it. Traditional politics is fundamentally a struggle to capture the state, right? It's all about seizing command of the existing institutions. But prefigurative practice shifts the goalposts entirely. The goal isn't to conquer those institutions. The goal is to render them obsolete. By creating wildly successful living examples of cooperation and mutuality at the local level, you prove that the hierarchical state is simply unnecessary for human flourishing. Ultimately, the text defines prefigurative politics as being both a compass and a method. It guides movements away from just reproducing domination and points them toward cultivating genuine reciprocity. In this view, liberation ceases to be this promised endpoint at the end of a long, dark, authoritarian tunnel. Actually, scratch that. It's not a destination at all. Liberation becomes an unfolding practice. It is something you enact here and now, in the way you share resources, the way you make decisions, and how you treat your community members every single day. The source leaves us with this incredible metaphor. The revolution cannot be an authoritarian bridge to freedom, because the bridge itself shapes the destination. If domination is built into the foundation, it's going to be there when you arrive. So I'm going to leave you with this question to ponder at your next collective meeting. If the bridge shapes the destination, how do your daily community gatherings, your conflict resolutions, and yes, even your chore wheels reflect the exact world you are trying to build? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep building the new world today.